Imagine staying in a coastal hotel room tonight and, you are entirely alone.
Right, just totally isolated.
Yeah, exactly. It is quiet, the wind is howling outside, and across the room from you there is a second empty bed.
Which is already creepy enough on its own.
Oh, totally. So you imagine you have just turned out the lights and you settle in, and then from the other side of the room you hear the sheets on that empty bed begin to rustle.
It's such a visceral nightmare.
It really is. But before we tell you who engineered that exact scene back in 1904, we need to take a massive step back. Because the man who wrote that, well, he didn't even consider himself a horror writer at all.
No, not even a little bit.
Right. He was a man who basically spent his life surrounded by protective museum glass, and then somehow figured out exactly how to shatter it.
Yeah, and I think it is the ultimate subversion of expectations. I mean, we look at history, especially academic history, as something completely inert.
Yeah, like safe and dusty.
Exactly. We expect the ancient manuscript to just be fragile paper, or the medieval broadsword to be dull and useless.
Yeah.
But the man we are talking about today, he looked at those artifacts and saw landscapes where the past just wasn't dead at all.
He was just waiting.
Exactly. Waiting and actively hostile.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. I want you to dim the lights wherever you are and just imagine a crackling fire in an old, drafty, wood-paneled Cambridge college room.
That is the perfect aesthetic for this.
It really is. And we've brought a massive stack of materials to the table today for you. We are looking at comprehensive biographical profiles, deep literary analyses of early 20th century horror, and, of course, the original text of a legendary 1904 short story.
Plus some really exhaustive modern catalogs of all the television, radio, and audio adaptations.
Right. So our mission today is to uncover the life, the mechanics, and the enduring legacy of M.R. James. He was this esteemed medievalist who, almost by accident, completely defined the modern antiquarian ghost story.
Which is just wild when you think about it.
It is. So, okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin with a guy whose weekend hobby basically birthed the monsters that still haunt our media landscape over a century later?
Well, to understand the horror, you really have to understand the mind that created it. And that requires looking at his day job.
Right, because fiction was not his main thing.
Not at all. So Montague Rhodes James was born in 1862, and he lived until 1936. But the most critical piece of context you need is that writing fiction was entirely secondary for him.
He was a serious academic.
Oh, top tier.
Yeah.
Highly respected. He was the provost of King's College, Cambridge from 1905 to 1918, and then he became the provost of Eton College from 1918 until his death.
Wow.
Yeah, his scholarly output wasn't just impressive, it was historically monumental.
Yeah, when I was looking through his biographical profile, the sheer volume of his cataloging work just leaped off the page. I mean, we aren't talking about a librarian making a simple list of books here.
No, not at all. He cataloged medieval manuscripts for institutions all over the UK, like Gonville and Caius College, the Fitzwilliam Museum, the Maclean Collection.
That sounds like a massive undertaking.
It was. This meant dealing with paleography, which is the study of historical writing systems. He was deciphering faded, centuries-old Latin that had been written by monks with, wildly varying degrees of literacy.
Oh, I can't even imagine trying to read that handwriting.
Right. He was identifying the provenance of lost texts, essentially piecing together the fragmented intellectual history of Europe.
So he was the ultimate authority, basically the guy you called when you had a crumbling book from the 12th century and no idea what it said.
Exactly. He was the guy.
But what absolutely hooked me was this one specific event in 1903. It's basically his real-life Indiana Jones moment. Because he didn't just stay in the library.
Ah, right, the Bury St. Edmunds excavation. Yes, this is where his textual brilliance translated into tangible, physical discovery.
Which is so cool.
It really is, and it perfectly illustrates how his mind worked. So in 1902, James was studying a specific medieval manuscript, the Chronicle of the Abbey of St. Edmund.
Okay, and who wrote that?
It was written by a 12th century monk named Jocelyn de Brakelond. It's this fascinating document that details the daily life, the politics, and the architecture of the abbey under the rule of Abbot Sampson.
And I feel like most scholars would read that, write a nice little paper analyzing the monk's prose, and just call it a day.
Totally. That's what you'd expect. But James didn't just read it as literature, he read it as a schematic.
Like a blueprint.
Yes. The Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds was once one of the richest Benedictine monasteries in England. but it was largely destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s.
So it was just a ruin by his time.
Exactly. For centuries, it was just a massive, sprawling ruin. The graves of the abbots were considered completely lost to time. But James noticed that Jocelyn de Brakelon had recorded highly specific details about where certain abbots were buried in the chapter house.
Oh, wow. Like in relation to the walls and the altar and stuff.
Exactly that. So he takes the 700-year-old text and uses it as a literal treasure map.
That is amazing.
James actually directed excavations in the dirt and masonry of the ruins based solely on his translation of this medieval Latin. He mapped out the dimensions of the lost chapter house, calculated the spacing, and told the diggers exactly where to strike the ground.
And they found something.
In early 1903, they hit stone coffins.
No way.
Yes. James had located the lost 12th century graves of several abbots, including Abbot Sampson himself and Abbot Ording. He found them exactly where the manuscripts said they would be.
Wait, let's just sit with that for a second. He read a crumbling manuscript, walked out into a ruined abbey, and literally dug up the dead.
It's incredible, right?
You could not write a more perfect origin story for a horror author. It's almost too on the nose. Like he's literally disturbing ancient graves.
It is very on the nose. And this brings us to exactly why this background is so crucial to his fiction. James wasn't sitting in a garret somewhere trying to invent fantastical high fantasy worlds like Tolkien or Dunsany.
Right, he wasn't making up magic systems.
No, his horror is grounded in an almost suffocating historical realism. When he writes a story about a protagonist finding a strange document in a ruined abbey, he knows exactly how that document should smell.
Because he's held them.
Exactly. He knows how the faded iron gall ink looks on vellum. He knows how the damp masonry of an English ruin feels under your hand. And most importantly, he knows exactly where a forgotten grave would actually be located.
He brings this level of authenticity that makes the supernatural elements hit so much harder just because the mundane elements are flawlessly accurate.
Precisely. It lulls you into a false sense of security.
But looking at his personality in the sources, I found this massive paradox. Because he was a strict traditionalist, right? Like, he loved Shakespeare, he loved Dickens, but he actively despised the modernists.
Oh, he really did.
Yeah, he famously called James Joyce a charlatan and a prostituter of life and language. He also completely loathed Aldous Huxley.
Yes, he was very much a man of his era, his class, and his institutional standing. He held very conservative political views, which you can read in his private correspondence.
Right, we saw that in the letters.
He was vocally against the Irish Home Rule movement, and he had a deep-seated hatred for communism. His friend A.C. Benson described him as deeply reactionary.
So he just really didn't like change.
Basically, he was someone who genuinely preferred the past to the present, and who viewed modernity and progress with deep suspicion. And, to be clear to you listening, we aren't passing judgment on these historical views.
Right, we're just impartially reporting on the facts to understand where the guy was coming from.
Exactly. We are simply looking at the factual worldview of the author to understand the architecture of his mind and his stories.
But wait, help me understand this contradiction, though. He hates Joyce and Huxley, but he's pioneering a completely new style of horror. Isn't that technically modernism in its own right? Like, he's creating a modern blueprint for a genre.
It's a brilliant question. But we really have to separate modernism as a literary movement from modernity as an era.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Sure. James despised the modernist literary movement, the stream of consciousness, the breaking of structural rules, the explicit focus on internal psychology. He wanted literature to have rules, boundaries, and very traditional structures.
So he liked a clear beginning, middle, and end.
Exactly. Yet, ironically, by stripping away the Gothic castles and the clanking chains of the Victorian era, and placing his horror in the everyday, recognizable world of trains, hotels, and academics, he did create the modern horror template.
It's like, okay, imagine a brilliant computer programmer today who absolutely despises the modern internet.
Okay, I'm with you.
He hates social media, he hates constant connectivity. So just to entertain himself on the weekends, he writes the ultimate, most sophisticated piece of malware. And by doing so, he inadvertently changes the entire tech landscape forever, despite hating it.
I see where you're going with the malware analogy, and it's clever, but I actually have to push back on that a bit based on the sources.
Oh, really? Why?
Because malware is designed to be indiscriminate. It spreads everywhere to everyone as fast as possible. James's stories were the exact opposite.
Oh, I see. They were more targeted.
Very targeted. They were highly bespoke traps. He engineered a very specific system designed to terrify a very specific demographic. his own peers. He didn't just write spooky tales, he built an architectural framework for dread.
Okay, let's explore that framework, because once you see the Jamesian formula, it is impossible to unsee it. And what's brilliant is how organic it feels when you're reading. You don't realize you're being led into a trap.
That's the genius of it. And the trap always starts with the setting. It is never a desolate, jagged peak in Transylvania.
Right, no spooky thunderstorms over a castle.
Never. It's usually a characterful, idyllic English location. A seaside town in the off-season, a quiet village, or a venerable university library. It is a place characterized by safety, routine, and often a profound sense of boredom.
And into this boring, safe space wanders our protagonist. He is almost always a nondescript, somewhat naive bachelor scholar.
Yes, someone very much like James or the colleagues who's actually reading these stories to.
Right. This guy is rational, he's slightly fussy about his tea or his golf game, and he's usually on a holiday or a research trip.
And this is the critical vulnerability. Because this protagonist is an academic, he suffers from the fatal flaw of his profession.
Let me guess, he is terminally curious.
Exactly. And that curiosity leads to the catalyst, the discovery of an antiquarian object.
A dusty book, a piece of stained glass, an old crown, or a whistle.
Precisely. And the moment that object is touched, removed, or investigated too closely, it unlocks a supernatural menace.
But we must be very clear about the nature of this menace, right?
Yes, absolutely. In his essays on the genre, James was explicit about his rules. He wrote that he had absolutely no use for amiable and helpful apparitions.
So you are not getting Casper the Friendly Ghost.
No, you are not.
And you are not getting a tragic Victorian lady in white who just wants you to find her lost locket so she can go to heaven?
Definitely not. His ghosts are malevolent, odious, and fundamentally hostile to the living. They represent the past, actively seeking to punish the present.
They don't want your help.
No, they want your life, or at the very least, your sanity.
And it all ties into this overarching theme that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. His protagonists are punished specifically for doing exactly what academics are supposed to do, which is dig deeper.
Exactly. But how James executes this punishment on the page is what really secures his legacy. As a medievalist, James was intimately familiar with a concept called lacuna.
Oh, let's define that for the listener because it's a great term.
A lacuna is basically a gap. In paleography and manuscript study, it refers to a missing section of text.
Like a page torn out.
Yes, maybe a page was torn out, maybe the ink was washed away by water damage centuries ago, or maybe the scribe just accidentally skipped a line. It's an empty space where knowledge should be.
Got it.
As a scholar, James spent his life trying to fill in these lacunae. But as a horror writer, he weaponized them. We call this his art of omission.
So instead of describing the monster in painstaking detail, he just gives you the gap. He leaves it blank.
He gives you just enough detail to jumpstart your imagination, and then he goes completely silent. Look at his sentence structures when the horror arrives.
He's not doing a clinical breakdown of a demon's anatomy.
No, he focuses entirely on suggestion and texture.
There is a perfect example of this in the story Canon Alberic's scrapbook. The protagonist, Deniston, is in southern France.
Right, and he buys this ancient, fascinating scrapbook.
Yeah. Later, he's sitting in his room at night, studying it, and he feels something behind him.
And notice how James describes it. He doesn't say a giant demon stood behind him. He writes that Deniston saw a shape rising behind his seat.
Just a shape.
Yes. And the only descriptors James provides are that it is black, thin, and hairy. He gives you the terrifying tactile qualities, the texture, and leaves your brain desperately trying to assemble those textures into a face.
That is so much scarier than just giving a full description. Or take the stalls of Barchester Cathedral. This one genuinely gives me the creeps.
Oh, it's so good.
The archdeacon is walking down the stairs in the dark, and he feels a large cat slip between his feet. A perfectly normal, mundane experience for anyone who owns a pet res.
Very relatable.
But then, later in his diary, he writes the anomaly. He just notes, there is no kitchen cat.
It is the delayed realization of the anomaly. The gap between the physical sensation, soft fur brushing against your leg, and the rational understanding that nothing should actually be there.
You know, I was thinking about this antiquarian curiosity, and I realized we do the exact same thing today. It's identical to modern internet behavior.
Oh, really? How so?
Think about it. It's 2 a.m. You're lying in bed. You're completely safe. But you start scrolling, and you stumble onto a terrifying Reddit thread, or you find a bizarre, cryptic Wikipedia rabbit hole.
Right, you go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Every rational alarm bell in your head is ringing. You know you should turn off the screen and go to sleep. But the mystery is just too compelling. You have to know what's at the bottom of the thread.
You can't help yourself.
Exactly. And by satisfying that curiosity, you invite that anxiety, that metaphorical demon, into your safe space.
That is a fantastic analogy, and we can actually take it a step further. When you fall down that internet rabbit hole, or when you download a piece of software, you are inevitably presented with a terms of service agreement.
Oh my gosh.
A long, dense block of text that warns you of the consequences, which you blindly click accept on without truly reading or understanding.
Nobody reads the terms of service.
Nobody. And James's characters do the exact same thing with ancient Latin inscriptions. They read the warning, they translate the warning, and then they completely ignore the warning.
Yes. Which brings us perfectly to the ultimate example of this. We need to take a massive deep dive into his 1904 masterpiece, Oh, Whistle, and I'll Come to You, My Lad.
Oh, absolutely. If there is one story that encapsulates everything we've just talked about, it is this one.
Without a doubt.
It is arguably his most famous work, and it perfectly executes the formula. Let's walk through the mechanics of it. We begin with our protagonist, Professor Parkins.
Right, and James describes him as a professor of ontography at Cambridge. Okay, before you go further, what on earth is a professor of ontography? Because I read that and assumed it was a typo for ontology, like the philosophical study of being.
It's a completely understandable leap, but it's actually something different and a very deliberate, slightly satirical choice by James.
Oh, okay, so what is it?
Ontography, especially in the academic context of the early 1900s, referred to the descriptive study of the geographical distribution of human beings and their cultures. It's essentially human geography.
Ah, okay, so he studies how humans interact with their landscape, which is incredibly ironic, considering what the landscape is about to do to him.
Exactly. It's a great little joke by James. Parkins is rational, he's a skeptic, he's a bit pompous, and he is taking a golfing holiday in a town called Burnstow.
And Burnstow is based on a real place, right?
Yes. We know from historical context that Burnstow is essentially a fictionalized stand-in for Felixstowe, a coastal town in Suffolk.
So Parkins arrives in Burnstow and secures a room at the Globe Inn. And James immediately, in the very first few pages, plants a tiny seed of unease. Parkins is slightly uncomfortable because his hotel room contains a second empty bed.
It's a beautifully mundane detail. Most people wouldn't give it a second thought. But James is laying the architectural groundwork for the climax. It's the lacuna of the room, the empty space that needs to be filled.
Right. So while he's there, a colleague asks him to do a little professional favor. There are the ruins of a Knights Templar preceptory down near the beach, and the colleague wants Parkins to check it out and see if it's a good spot for an archaeological dig.
A classic academic side quest.
Exactly. So after a round of golf with a fellow guest named Colonel Wilson, who is sort of the grounded, practical foil to Parkins's academic snobbery, Parkins goes exploring.
The setting James paints here is crucial. It's a desolate, windswept shingle beach. It's getting dark. Parkins is poking around the ancient, crumbling masonry of the preceptory, and he finds a small hole.
He just reaches right in.
He reaches in, again, the tactile interaction with the past, and pulls out an ancient bronze whistle.
He literally pulls an object out of the earth. So he pockets it and starts the long walk back to the inn.
This is where the haunting subtly begins. As he is walking back along this desolate beach, the wind howling around him, he notices something in the distance behind him.
Oh, this part is so creepy.
James describes it as the shape of a rather indistinct personage. It seems to be making great efforts to catch up with Parkins, but strangely, making no progress. It's just a shape struggling in the wind.
It's so eerie, because it's not immediately threatening, it's just wrong.
Yeah.
But Parkins gets back to his safe space, his room at the inn.
Right, he locks himself in.
He sits down, cleans the hard-packed dirt out of the whistle, empties the soil out the window, and when he looks out into the dark, he sees a solitary figure standing on the shore, just facing the inn.
Just staring.
Yeah. Now, Parkins, being an academic, he ignores the creepy figure and focuses on the object. He inspects the whistle and finds 2 Latin inscriptions.
This is where James flexes his paleography muscles and gives Parkins his terms of service agreement. The first inscription reads, Quis est iste venit?
And Parkins translates this easily, right?
Yes, he translates it as, who is this who is coming?
Which, honestly, if you find that carved on a bone-white bronze whistle in a graveyard, you throw the whistle into the ocean.
Well, a rational person would, but a scholar must know more. The second inscription is a bit more cryptic. It's a cross shape with 4 syllables, Fur, F-L-A, F-L-E-B-I-S.
And what does that mean?
It's a puzzle.
Yeah.
If you put it together, it forms the Latin words fur, flabis, flebis, which translates as roughly to, thief, if you shall blow, you shall weep.
It is a literal warning label. Do not operate this ancient artifact.
It could not be clearer.
And what does our brilliant, rational professor of ontography do?
He blows the whistle.
Of course he does. He just has to. And the sound it makes is incredible. James describes it as a note that has a quality of infinite distance. And the very second he blows it, a massive gale of wind violently surges outside his window.
That night, the haunting transitions from the external landscape into his internal psychology. Parkins cannot sleep. He falls into a feverish state and experiences these horrible, vivid visions.
What does he see?
He dreams of a man running frantically over the beach groins, constantly looking back in absolute terror.
The groins being those wooden breakwaters that stretch out into the ocean, right?
Yes. The man is clambering over them, exhausted, terrified, and then Parkins sees what is chasing the man. James writes that it is a figure in pale, fluttering draperies, ill-defined, moving with an unnatural, terrifying speed.
That is just awful. So Parkins wakes up, he tries to light a match, but he hears this distinct scurrying sound on the floor of his room.
And, of course, he rationalizes it.
Yeah, he tells himself it's just rats. Typical academic denial. The next morning, the hotel maid comes in and mentions that both beds in his room appear to have been slept in. The sheets on the empty bed are crumpled and thrown about.
Parkins, desperate to maintain his rational worldview, says he must have messed them up while he was unpacking his portmanteau. He refuses to see the lacuna filling up.
But the tension keeps escalating. Later that day, a terrified local boy outside the inn reports seeing a white figure waving frantically from Parkins's window while Parkins wasn't even in the room.
It's getting closer.
And finally, we reach the climax of the story. The second night.
Parkins goes to sleep. Because the moon is so bright, he has built a makeshift partition out of a rug and an umbrella to block the light from his eyes.
Which just sounds so precarious.
It is. And it collapses in the middle of the night, waking him up. The room is flooded with moonlight, and he sees a figure sitting up on the unused bed.
Just imagine the sheer freezing terror of that moment. You are in your locked hotel room, and someone or something is sitting on the other bed.
Parkins leaps out of his bed, rushing toward the window to grab his walking cane for defense. The entity instantly reacts. It moves to block the door, trapping him.
Oh, that's game over.
And James describes its movements beautifully. It is blind. It gropes around the room, stooping over, physically feeling the pillow and the sheets of Parkins' bed to see if he is still in it.
The tactile horror again, it's touching his bed. When it realizes he's not in the bed, it turns and moves into the moonlight. And this is the moment of absolute genius.
It really is.
Parkins finally sees the entity's face. It is an intensely horrible face of crumpled linen.
It has no anatomy. It is just the sheets from the empty bed, animated by something formless and malevolent.
James takes the absolute oldest, most tired Scooby-Doo cliche of a ghost, a figure draped in a white bed sheet, and he makes it terrifyingly real. It's not a guy in a sheet. The sheet is the monster.
The entity backs the screaming Parkins halfway out the open window. He is literally about to fall to his death or be absorbed by this linen face when his golfing partner, Colonel Wilson, kicks the door open.
Saved at the last second.
Exactly. And at that exact moment, the apparition loses its form and simply collapses into a heap of mundane bedclothes on the floor.
Man, I need to take a breath just thinking about it. The sheer terror of mundane spaces in this story is unparalleled. Parkins' sanctuary, his hotel room, the very bed sheets he trusts to keep him warm and safe are weaponized against him.
It is the ultimate violation of sanctuary. And if we look at the historical context, there's some fascinating theories about where this incredibly specific nightmare came from.
Oh, really? Where did he get the idea?
The title itself is a nod to a 1793 poem by Robert Burns, but the imagery, S.T. Joshi, a prominent biographer and critic of weird fiction, suggests the ghost itself may have been inspired by a recurring childhood nightmare James suffered from.
Wait, really? A nightmare about a sheet?
A nightmare about something formless and white that chased him. Furthermore, there's a tragic real-life incident involving James's close friend, J.K. Stephen.
What happened to him?
Stephen suffered a severe, life-altering head injury in a riding accident because his horse was suddenly startled. The cause of the horse's panic. It was either a sudden, violent gust of wind or a loud whistle from a passing train.
Oh, wow. So he incorporated that trauma into the story.
Exactly. James took these fragments of his own reality, his nightmares, his friend's tragedy, his deep, knowledge of ancient landscapes, and wove them into a masterpiece.
That phrase you used earlier, tactile horror, is exactly what separates James from the Gothic writers who came before him. You read Mary Shelley or Bram Stoker, and the horror is grand, it's operatic, it's bloody.
Great dramatic.
Or you read Victorian ghost stories, and the ghosts are transparent, floating holograms that you can just wave your hand through. They are sad. But James's horrors are deeply physical. They are hairy, they are soft, they cling to you, they are fundamentally wrong.
And this brings us to a fascinating contradiction in James's work regarding the psychology of the scholar. James was a vocal, almost aggressive advocate for what he called reticence in horror literature.
Let's define reticence in this context, because it's an important word.
Reticence means restraint, holding back. He actively hated the wallowing and blatancy of gory modern stories. He found the inclusion of sex or explicit romance in literature to be, in his own words, tiresome. He believed in the nicely managed crescendo.
Right, so introduce the actors in a placid way, let them play some golf, and then let the ominous thing put its head out unobtrusively.
Precisely. But here is the contradiction. For a man who preached reticence, he wrote scenes of incredible savage violence.
I was going to say, I read Lost Hearts for this, and there is absolutely nothing reticent about that story.
Exactly. Lost Hearts features a sinister aristocratic dabbler in the occult who literally cuts the beating hearts out of living, pubescent children to achieve immortality.
Yeah, that is not restraint. That is brutal, visceral gore.
So how do we reconcile the man who demanded reticence with the man who wrote about ritualistic child murder?
That's a great question. How did the biographers reconcile it?
They look to the psychological readings of his life. Biographer Michael Cox suggests that these stories were a necessary release from feelings held in check. James lived a highly structured, celibate, institutionalized life.
So the stories were like an escape valve for his subconscious.
Very much so. Critic Julia Briggs goes further, noting an authorial revulsion from tactile contact with other people.
Oh, that makes so much sense. The horror in James's stories almost always revolves around unwanted physical touching. A hairy hand reaching out in the dark, a face of crumpled linen pressing against yours. It's a violation of personal boundaries.
If you view it through that lens, his monsters are the physical manifestations of academic anxiety.
Yes, think about it. You spend your entire life in the dusty archives. You study the past, you publish a paper, you dig up a relic, and you get it wrong. Or you disturb something that should have been left alone.
And the past physically reaches out to strangle you for your mistake.
It's the ultimate imposter syndrome nightmare. You aren't just wrong, you are going to be destroyed for being wrong.
If we connect this personal psychology to the bigger picture of the genre, this deeply physical, landscape-driven horror is exactly why M.R. James is widely considered the father of folk horror.
Okay, let's define folk horror clearly, because it's a term that gets thrown around a lot today with movies like Midsommar or The Wicker Man. But I want to understand how James started it. What separates it from Gothic horror?
Gothic horror is typically about the intrusion of the foreign or the unnatural into a civilized space. Dracula comes from Transylvania to London. The monster is an outsider. The setting is a looming artificial castle.
Okay, so what is folk horror?
Folk horror, on the other hand, is the terror of the soil itself. It is the realization that the landscape you walk on every day is soaked in blood, ancient rituals, and pagan beliefs that predate Christianity.
So the threat is already here?
The threat isn't an outsider at all. The threat is the history of the earth beneath your feet bubbling up to punish the arrogant modern man who thinks he can just pave over it or catalog it and walk away.
So when Parkins pulls the whistle out of the Templar ruin, he isn't just finding an object, he's pulling a thread that unravels the civilized illusion of the English landscape. It's brilliant.
It really is the perfect encapsulation of the genre.
And what absolutely marvels me is how well these intensely visual yet incredibly restrained stories translate to other mediums. You would think the art of omission, the very fact that he doesn't describe the monster, would make them impossible to adapt for television or audio, but it's the exact opposite.
Which makes perfect sense when you remember their origins. These stories were not originally designed to be read silently from a printed page.
Right, they were a performance.
They were inherently designed to be heard.
Right, the famous Christmas Eve traditions. Let's talk about those.
Exactly. James would invite a select group of friends, colleagues, and favorite students to his rooms at King's College, Cambridge, and later at Eton. He would wait until late on Christmas Eve, turn down the gas lamps, stand by the crackling fire, and read his latest manuscript aloud from his own handwritten pages.
That sounds incredibly atmospheric.
By all accounts, he was an excellent performer. He knew exactly how to pace the delivery, when to pause, when to drop his voice to a whisper. That oral tradition, that sense of a voice in the dark, is fundamentally baked into the DNA of his text.
And that DNA absolutely exploded into a massive legacy of adaptation. If we look at the television and audio footprint of M.R. James, it is staggering. In the UK, his name is essentially synonymous with Christmas television.
Yes, the BBC's A Ghost Story for Christmas Tradition. This was a series spearheaded by the brilliant director Lawrence Gordon Clark in the 1970s.
And they did a bunch of James's stories, right?
Clark adapted several of James's stories, like The Stalls of Barchester and A Warning to the Curious. These adaptations were shot on 16mm film, and they captured that bleak, wintry, historical dread perfectly. They are still considered masterclasses in television horror.
We also have the famous 1968 Jonathan Miller television adaptation of Whistle and I'll Come to You, starring Michael Horton as Professor Parkins. That adaptation is legendary.
So it really stripped away all the excess.
Yeah, Miller completely stripped away any gothic melodrama and just focused on the stark, terrifying isolation of the beach and the utter psychological collapse of this pompous academic. And let's not forget the 1957 feature film Night of the Demon, directed by Jacques Tourneur, which is a phenomenal adaptation of James's story, Casting the Runes.
But while the visual adaptations are iconic, the audio legacy is where the oral tradition truly lives on.
Audio is just the perfect medium for it.
It is. From the 1940s CBS escape radio plays in America to a legendary 1963 BBC radio play where Michael Horton actually played Parkins years before he did the television version. Audio drama is the truest heir to James's fireside readings.
And it continues right up to today. The sheer volume of podcast adaptations is incredible. In 2020, the White Heron Theater produced a full-cast audio drama of Whistle that updated the setting to modern-day Nantucket, and it was broadcast on NPR.
Which was a really fascinating take on it.
But even beyond big productions, like literally if you go on your phone right now and search the phrase Spotify podcast M.R. James, you are going to be hit with an absolute wall of content.
Oh, completely. It is staggering how much is out there.
You'll find incredible modern iterations like Shadows at the Door, the podcast which continues to adapt, dissect, and perform his work for a whole new generation of listeners. The indie audio fiction community has fully embraced him.
What's truly fascinating here is a brilliant, almost unbelievable historical loop regarding one of his adaptations. It involves the legendary actor Christopher Lee.
Oh, I love this part.
Most of our listeners know him as Dracula or Saruman from The Lord of the Rings or Count Dooku from Star Wars. But when Christopher Lee was a young boy in the 1930s, applying for entry into Eton College for a scholarship,
No way! The interviewer.
the person who interviewed young Christopher Lee and awarded him the scholarship was the provost of Eton, M.R. James himself.
That is incredible. The man who had become the face of cinematic Gothic horror was evaluated by the father of folk horror.
Yes. And decades later, in the year 2000, Christopher Lee actually played M.R. James in a BBC miniseries. He sat in a wood-paneled room reading James's ghost stories straight to the camera by candlelight, perfectly recreating those original Cambridge Christmas Eve gatherings.
That genuinely gives me chills. The past reaching out and touching the present, but in a deeply beautiful, artistic way this time. So looking at this massive catalog, the BBC shows, the radio plays, the endless search result for a Spotify podcast on M.R. James, what does this all mean for us today? Why does a fussy, conservative medievalist from 1904 still dominate our audio landscape?
Because audio forces the listener to do exactly what James's prose demands. It forces your brain to become a co-conspirator in the horror.
That is such a great way to put it.
When a television show tries to show you a monster, it is limited by the budget of its special effects department. It usually looks like rubber or CGI. But when an audio narrator whispers about a hairy, thin thing rising in the dark or a face of crumpled linen, your imagination fills that lacuna with whatever scares you the most. Audio relies entirely on suggestion and atmosphere, which are the exact two pillars of Jamesian terror.
Think about you, the listener, right now, having a voice in your ear telling you a terrifying story while you walk your dog in the dark or while you're doing the dishes in an empty house. That is the exact modern equivalent of sitting around a fire at King's College in 1904. The technology changed from crackling logs to digital podcasts, but the delivery mechanism, a solitary voice in the dark, is exactly the same.
Exactly. June understood that true horror doesn't need to be loud, it doesn't need to be explicit, and it certainly doesn't need cheap jump scares. True horror just needs to patiently wait in the margins and then quietly tap you on the shoulder when you are absolutely certain you are alone.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We have journeyed from the dusty, manuscript-filled archives of Cambridge to the terrifying, windswept shingle beaches of Burnstow. We've seen how a highly respected medievalist used a real-world excavation at Bury St. Edmunds to ground his fiction in historical reality.
We really covered a lot of ground today.
We did. We learned how his weekend hobby gave birth to the modern antiquarian ghost story, completely shaping the genre of folk horror. M.R. James taught us that intellectual curiosity always has a price, and that the past is never as dead or as buried as we want it to be.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, expanding on your analogy from earlier. We've talked endlessly today about the haunted antiquarian artifact, the medieval bronze whistle, the ancient scrapbook, the cursed runic symbols.
Right, the dangerous objects.
We view those objects as dangerous because they are old. But time keeps moving. Imagine an antiquarian 1,000 years from now. They are excavating the ruins of our 21st century civilization, and they dig up a mundane object from your life right now.
Oh, this is a fantastic thought experiment.
Say they dig through the rubble of your home and find your smartphone, or an old encrypted thumb drive tucked in the back of a desk drawer. If that future scholar manages to power it on, what hidden anxieties, what unresolved digital ghosts or modern curses might they accidentally unleash?
What is the modern equivalent of the Latin inscription on the whistle?
Exactly. When they look at the cracked glass of your screen, what is the warning label on your digital life that simply says, "Thief, if you shall blow, you shall weep"?
That is going to keep me up tonight. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Think twice before you pick up any old souvenirs on the beach this summer. Be careful what links you click at 2 a.m. and take a good hard look at the ghosts hiding in your own everyday objects. Because remember, that museum glass you think is keeping you safe, it's incredibly fragile, and the things on the other side, they might just be waiting for you to look a little too closely.